Hello, my name is Roxana Maria Aras and I'm a PhD candidate in the Anthropology and History Program at the University of Michigan. I am currently in my 6th year. Originally, I'm from Romania, but I presently live and work in Beirut, Lebanon. And now, before I continue, I'd like to say thank you to the International Institute for offering me this opportunity. It is not very often that I get the chance to talk about my multiple identities and how they get along or how they do not get along. My research and a large part of my life revolves around the Arab Christian communities in the Middle East. I explore how religious identities are grounded in stories of everyday life, but also influenced by larger political, social, and economic structures. I am particularly interested in the Arab Orthodox Christians in Lebanon and how they live and understand their identities in the multi-confessional environment such as Lebanon. Now, this country has 18 recognized religious denominations and a political system structured along sectarian lines. What does this mean? It means that political functions are ascribed according to sectarian quotas. For example, the head of the republic must always be the president, must always be a Christian Maronite. The prime minister must always be a Sunni Muslim, and the speaker of the House of Representatives must always be a Shia Muslim. Now, why do I research this? Why do I do this? One of the aims is to rather challenge these recurrent narratives of Christian communities as victimized minorities and this constant need of Western intervention and salvation. This is not to say that these communities are not persecuted. They have been and still are persecuted. However, we can also build narratives of empowered minorities that do have the necessary agency to actually negotiate their long-lasting presence and history in the Middle East, which is, after all, their home. At the same time, I do want to challenge these stereotypical narratives of the Middle East characterized by a banality of violence that emerges from a constant recurrent focus on conflict, on the rise of Islamic fundamentalist movements, on wars such as the Yemeni war, the Syrian revolution, the Lebanese war. How do I do it? In other words, methodology. My work combines ethnographic and archival research, where I look at photographic archives and newspapers archives. I conduct interviews with members of these communities, but I also spend time with them. I attend religious rituals, I attend their social events, I build relations, and I build networks. One of the reasons why I chose University of Michigan in general and the Anthropology and History Program in particular is connected to something that I call research-grounded creativity. I think my department strives to create this engaging environment where students can experiment, explore, try, play, in other words, where with the different theoretical frameworks, conceptual frameworks, different theories. Unfortunately, during my time, this was not available in my country, Romania, and neither was anthropology a grounded, well-developed discipline. Now, being a graduate student, international graduate student at a US institution doing area studies results in a constant negotiation of languages, of cultural practices, of bureaucratic systems that I have to navigate. For example, I am educated in English, yet I conduct my research in Arabic and I talk to my family in Romanian. All these negotiations have engendered an uncomfortable feeling of belonging to this in-between that is in a constant look for definition, constantly looks for a definition. Paradoxically, it is actually this feeling of uncomfortable belonging in between, together with the creative environment at Michigan, that have allowed me to a certain extent challenge area studies and the politics of defining a geographical area, not defining an area of study. And let's take, for example, the term the Middle East. Now, this is a rather recent term, and it's a term that has gained momentum and started to be used as an object of study once with the emergence of area studies at the end of the Second World War and during the Cold War. So it is actually these international events and the national interests of the US that came to define the research possibilities and the type of scholarship that emerges from the study of these bounded geographical areas. As an alternative that is not here to challenge or cancel area studies, but rather to add to it, to complement it, to enrich it. As an alternative that requires a change of angle, where we don't look at bounded geographical areas, but we rather look at connections, we look at networks, and we look at how people, objects, materialities, information, representations, stories, travel are exchanged across these networks, across these connections. I think when we combine these two different perspectives, we can come up with richer narratives of what we want to study, and in my case, the Christian communities in the Middle East. I think one of the advantages, and if I may say so, the least romantic, is financial support. Across my doctoral years at the University of Michigan, I was privileged to enjoy several fellowships and research grants that have allowed me to focus on my research. I am currently under a Dracon pre-doctoral fellowship, which allows me to focus particularly on writing my thesis. Now, when I use the word privilege, I do not use it lightly, because financial support is something that is difficult to achieve in the Middle East and also in my native country, Romania. Yet paradoxically, this financial support can also turn into a challenge. Why is that? These fellowships and these grants are time limited. Every time as an international graduate student, I have to think ahead of alternative potential sources of funding. This, on a long term, creates a feeling of financial precarity. And this financial precarity is actually enhanced by a difference of accessibility. What do I mean by a difference of accessibility? International graduate students have less opportunities in comparison to US citizens for applying for different scholarships and research. And this difference has been a constant across my journey as a PhD student in a US institution. Now, another challenge is that I am far away from my scholarly community and the very creative environment that I just described a couple of minutes ago. As an anthropologist, I'm required to do field research and to spend several years in my field. This creates this feeling of alienation from my scholarly community, and this feeling of alienation, better said isolation, has been enhanced by the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, being in Lebanon, I am not so open towards engaging, and I do not have so many possibilities towards engaging in discussions about theoretical and conceptual networks and exchanging ideas and experiences with my fellow graduate students. And finally, another challenge that is actually one that is the most cumbersome to me is connected to the politics of Western, by Western I mean European and American scholarship and research on areas that have a history of colonialism and a present of neocolonialism. From curriculum to syllabi to discourses and representations, I strongly feel that higher education in US and Europe is riddled with biases that need to be constantly challenged, criticized, undone, and reconstructed in more politically correct ways. In order to give an example for this challenge, I shall refer to anthropology, my discipline. Now, the history of anthropology has built this pattern where the scholar from a US institution goes to the exotic place, in my case, the Middle East, gathers and extracts the data, and returns in the comfort of his or her office at the US institution and starts to produce knowledge. Now, this pattern reproduces a series of relations of power that have characterized different colonial empires and different colonial regimes in the Middle East. Now, in order to fight against this pattern, I decided to write my thesis from Beirut, from Lebanon. But at the same time, in my theoretical engagements, I try as much as possible to look at the Middle East not only as a place to extract data, but rather a center for production of knowledge that can come out of the Middle East and can be used in theoretical structures in anthropology, theoretical frameworks in anthropology. During the last 2 years, I have been in Beirut, Lebanon. Now, I personally and Lebanon as a country in general have been affected by several events during the last 2 years. You have the nationwide protests that started in October 2019 and continued until January 2020, and they are still unfolding to a certain extent. You have the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then you have the August 4th explosion in the port of Beirut. All these events triggered complex, interconnected regimes of precarity and uncertainty. In my case, these regimes challenged me to do methodological and ethical adjustments to my research and also to my presence in Lebanon, in Beirut, Lebanon. For example, once with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic and the establishment of the national lockdown, I could no longer conduct interviews or conduct face-to-face encounters with my interlocutors, mostly for safety reasons, of course, but also for my ethical commitments towards the safety and the well-being of these communities. So what I did instead, I reshifted my focus and I looked at the types of activities and the types of rituals and discussions emerging in the online as part of the as a reply, as a reaction to the lockdown, to the COVID-19 lockdown and its restrictions. In the case of the nationwide protests from October 2019, roads were blocked, violent clashes happened in the streets. I could not reach actually my field sites. So what I did, I again changed perspectives and I decided to cover these protests. I would go down in the streets together with my Lebanese friends and my friends who also research on Lebanon. We would collect data and we would try to build this multi-sensorial archive of the protest and how the protests are unfolding and the type of discourses that were being were emerging from the protests and the people in the streets. An active in the making multi-sensorial archive. In the case of the August 4th explosion, lastly, since I was physically and mentally affected by this explosion, I decided to take a break from my research, and I actually focused on getting involved in voluntary in NGO activities and in doing work with associations and with organizations that were actually affected by the explosion. And interestingly, I came to help the very organizations where I started doing archival research 2 years ago. The Lebanese have this expression that has annoyed me a year ago. It was a constant source of annoyance for me. And then this expression is Kil yom biyomu, which could translate as each day in its own turn. Now, this expression used to annoy me because I couldn't plan much on a long run, on weeks, on a weekly basis, mostly because everything was unfolding each day in its own time. Now, after the explosion, after the nationwide protests, after the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think this has become to a certain extent my motto. I just try to take each day in its own individuality and to be grateful of what I have achieved in that particular day, whether it is part of my research, part of my personal life, or part of the community that I am here in Lebanon, there in the United States, and there in Romania. Thank you.